Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this conference, which recapitulates a two-year project, historical buildings in times of climate crisis. Apart from taking advantage of today's meetings and panel sessions, I do hope that you're going to join our workshops, an opportunity to exchange experience, listen to others, network, and this is something I would like to and greatly encourage you to do, to share knowledge and exchange experience. This conference, which has a great pleasure of welcoming you, is also an opportunity to welcome everyone who has joined us from afar and our chief expert, Dr. Tomasz Jeleński. I would like to welcome our Croatian partners from Zagreb, Mihaela and Alexandra. Green Building Council are our Croatian partner. A keynote speaker, Ms. Alexandra Troy, and all experts responsible for delivering workshops. A warm welcome to our panel speakers as well. Without further ado, what are we about to witness? After a brief introduction, I am going to invite my friend from the foundation. My name is Agnesh Katrahovska. My apologies, I forgot to introduce myself. I had also been an expert on the project. I am part of the Sendzimir Foundation. I would like to welcome the entire Sendzimir Foundation team. They have been of great help to us in terms of organizing this event. After we summarize the project, Ewelina, Tomasz, and Alexandra will help us do that. We are going to focus on the renovation and retrofit of historical buildings in today's times of today's challenges, Alexandra Troy, and then we are going to be passing to another topic. We are going to welcome a person from the Łódź Infrastructural Company and a representative from a design studio. We are going to proceed after a coffee break to the workshop session. Nonetheless, we will provide you with further details later on. Now, Ewelina, would you please care to say a few words about our project? A very warm welcome to all of you. It will be my great pleasure to tell you what we have been doing over the past 2 years. I would like to tell you that climate change abatement in historical buildings has been funded by a financial instrument of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Climate Protection of the Federal Republic of Germany. Now, what were our main targets? We aimed to build awareness concerning methods and assignments that are climate and environment friendly with regard to historical buildings. We have also expanded the project to include buildings constructed until or around the 1960s. We have been focusing on historical buildings. Albeit case studies are all focusing on other buildings. Nonetheless, you can expand the array to include historical buildings as well. We're focusing on the transfer of knowledge and know-how between assorted professional groups. We invited a number of professional groups. I'm going to discuss that shortly. It was also very important to us to provide professional knowledge and professional guidelines aimed at renovating and retrofitting historical buildings in Poland and Croatia. Now, how did we decide to deliver the goals? As we proceed usually, we identified our challenges and potential solutions of problems affecting assorted stakeholder groups. 18 interviews in Poland kicked off our project for more than 30 persons representing assorted professional groups groups and stakeholder groups. In-depth interviews serve the purpose to share challenges as well as know-how concerning resolving issues in terms of deficits of knowledge or good practices or access to experts. Based on the basis of those interviews and the rated know-how, we designed a two-stage training course. Firstly, an online course over 1 month, over 300 participants. The course involved the presentation of a variety of educational problems and materials, and people resolved problems. Then we selected a group of 50 who were invited to join stage 2, that is face-to-face classroom workshops. A very warm welcome to all our former participants. They have arrived here in great numbers, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here. Now, classroom workshops and the entire training program, as aforesaid, has had involved a number of participants. And let me tell you something about main professional groups who had attended. We organized a study to close the e-learning stage. We used the Mentimeter tool. 129 respondents, not everybody who attended, but quite a representative group, you must admit. Now, the greatest numbers were represented by conservators of historical buildings, 22%, and architects, 22%. Follow-up, runners-up, construction engineers, 11%, and specialists for renovations, investments, and in local government units, 9%. We also had energy experts, employees of spatial planning, urban development, and local engineering units at local governments. Moreover, we also invited persons who are actually directly responsible for renovations and or for counseling and advice, not to mention the academia. The e-learning stage involved a series of webinars. I would like to present a graphic note that had been actually designed and developed during one of these sessions. This is a case study of the renovation of the Foundation for Polish Science in Warsaw and one building in Gdańsk. Now, there are a number of striking items, cooperation with historical building conservators, but also bind between different professional groups, not to mention the common target. All these professional groups are united in with a specific goal, that is to preserve the original structure of historical buildings for the future, for posterity, while focusing on thermal modernization and improving the quality of life for all residents and users. Cooperation and the willingness to talk, to converse, are part of the mission of the Sendzimir Foundation, who are focusing on uniting assorted professional groups for purpose of collaboration. Such had been the spirit behind our workshops. That was the second stage of our training course. Workshops in Mysłowice, Olsztyn, and Bielsko-Biała, our three partner cities and towns. 3 historical buildings were picked for each location with the aim of thermal modernization. Our e-learning course alumni and local governments had worked together to design a modernization or retrofit or revitalization blueprint. Your conference kit includes descriptions of 5 buildings, 2 buildings from Mysłowice, 1 building from Mysłowice, and a couple of other buildings, including one in Zagreb. We met with building administrators and representatives of local government. What you can see here is the local government in Mysłowice, 1 building in Olsztyn, and a tenement house, a townhouse in Bielsko-Biała. In the wake of these works, we met in working groups. We made every effort to develop ambitious, aspiring plans with the intent to renovate the buildings while improving their thermal energy balance or equilibrium. All that coincided with interviews and training courses. We were working on a publication at the same time. I would like to present the scientific editor of the publication, the Dr. Tomasz Jeleński of the Krakow University of Technology. He was actually working for 2 years on this publication. It is available in 2 languages, Polish and Croatian, and we also have an online version in the English language. Now over to Dr. Jeleński, who is going to discuss his work in detail.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dzień dobry Państwu.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is really great to see so many of you here in great numbers.
Ja chciałbym zacząć od podziękowań.
I would like to use this opportunity and thank everyone. Thank Ewelina and Agnieszka for excellent cooperation of the last 2 years. A very warm word of thanks to all our collaborators and partners. The Croatia Green Building Council, among others. Please let me say a few words about how this book came into being. Actually, this is also my first time when I have had the opportunity of actually handling the book. It is quite a unique moment for me. We are now awaiting further language versions. We are awaiting the Croatian version to be published. The English version is available online already. We have been working on the book for the past 2 years. We began with reference studies and obviously reference literature studies. This is when we ran into the first problems, obstacles. It turned out that there are very few reference sources with a focus on this particular field. I am truly grateful to Professor Troy for working with me to identify a single source reflecting anything and everything we had been looking for. Now, apart from that single book, which obviously does not cover the entire field we were exploring because it leans towards energy rather than climate, still became our fundamental source that we could continuously refer to in our work. Moreover, sources are there, knowledge is there. Nonetheless, it is hugely fragmented and dispersed. Our topic is multifaceted and interdisciplinary. It requires a transdisciplinary approach. It explores architecture and building conservation, construction, physics and physicality of buildings, not to mention a number of other issues, all of which had to be brought together with the specific links and connections identified between them, not to mention the fact that we had to seek and find solutions to resolve very complex issues concerning historical buildings. Obviously, all these issues are of great significance. It's not only about heritage and historical legacy, but it is also about energy poverty or impoverishment, if you will, and the quality of life. We had to explore on a number of issues continuously faced by the residents and users of historical buildings, not to mention administrators. Moreover, conservation authorities have a huge burden on their shoulders. We had to take into account amazing conservation knowledge, taking into account duties and responsibilities of authorities, of respective authorities as well, not least because investors expect swift responses of merit. There is one other thing that we have to consider: execution. Execution and related problems, we have to focus on how renovation is actually handled, how things are done in Poland, how frequently mistakes are actually committed. and how frequently we are actually basing our actions on assumptions that have no reflection in theory whatsoever. Nonetheless, they obviously focus on the selection of materials and related matters. All that leads to the identification of assorted problems, obstacles, and the functioning of historical buildings, their functioning space, their thermal retrofitting issues, and the quality of life for everyone related, people within and people in the immediate surroundings of these buildings. Obviously, this is something that that leaves a lot to be wished for, not least with regard to climate requirements, overall health of the building and of persons concerned. At the end of the day, it turned out that focal or pivotal components of our knowledge involved in-depth interviews. Anything that we could not find in terms of literary knowledge, or wherever the knowledge had been hugely fragmented or dispersed, well, that knowledge was available through our interlocutors. I would like to thank all those who had decided to spend some time with us and give in-depth interviews, not to mention follow-up meetings, and last but not least, workshops attended by actually over 20 or 30 experts had helped us to guide our participants through solutions adaptable for very difficult buildings in Poland and Croatia, respectively. The buildings that we had focused on during workshops were particularly difficult, particularly tedious. It goes without saying that case study selection is the best imaginable remedy for any kind of challenge that we identify in the course of our work. Only in the wake of these workshops had we actually managed to bring the entire book project together. This book is a manual combined with a set of guidelines and a textbook addressing many recipients. When designing the book, we had specialists in mind. We are definitely basing our knowledge on something akin to a, scientific apparatus, scientific method. Nonetheless, we aspired to write the book with the use of a vernacular comprehensible to anybody, to the administrator of municipal buildings, for example, including historical buildings and other users. We could go on and on about these users. We do hope that designers and architects will also refer to the book. And I hope they are joined by engineers for whom historical buildings are daily bread. Now, this book is also a product of a multiple of compromises. It had to be concise. It had to be compact. It had to be easy to read. It had to be a quick read. Nonetheless, it also necessarily had to be very credible by referencing books and other sources of scientific knowledge we decided to reference. I believe that this is just stage one. It is no more than the first stage of work that will most certainly require us to engage in a number of assorted works.
So frankly speaking, we will have a lot of work ahead of us in order to develop certain issues. Some issues are only signaled in the book. We only touched upon the very top surface of it because this is what the book required from us. However, this shows us that there's still material for new research and for new scientific articles. Thank you very much.
Ja jeszcze tylko dodam, że elementem integralnym
I'd only like to add that algorithms are an integral element of the book, so those of you who will join the workshops concerning algorithms will be able to test these algorithms together with our speaker. I would like to ask Alexander Janowicz from your council to take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you in such large numbers. I am very happy that we managed to attract so many people who are interested in this very important topic. My name is Alexander Jelovac, and I'm very happy that I'm able to join you here from Croatia Green Building Council. Thank you very much to Sendzimir Foundation, to a lovely organization of this final conference. From my point of view, this is a day to celebrate. This is a day of celebration because after 2 years of cooperating, very hard work, involving many stakeholders, we are bringing this project to an end. And as you already heard from Tomasz and from Evelina of all the achievements that we managed to do throughout this project, I'll just briefly talk about organization that I'm coming from, Croatia Green Building Council, and I will share a few words from our perspective of what we have done throughout the project. So a Green Building Council or Croatian Green Building Council is the largest organization in Croatia and in the whole world in the field of sustainable construction and energy efficiency. On this world map, showed in green are all the countries where we are present. There are more than 80 green building councils all around the world. We are a members organization having more than 100 members just in Croatia, and all around the world there is more than 36,000 different companies who are working very hard every day to bring sustainable and green into our everyday living. The members are from the field of construction, from energy, from economy, from public administration, and of course from the sector of academia. We as Croatia Green Building Council are part of the World Green Building Council and the European Regional Network. Here on this slide you can just see all of our current members. Every day more and more members are joining us. And if you're interested in creating some sort of cooperation with us or with your Polish Green Building Council, feel free to approach us, and if this is something that would interest you. Very briefly on how we organize our every day-to-day work, we can talk about working in 3 different sectors. The first one, as I already mentioned, are our members. The second one are the events that we organize on a yearly basis. More than 5,000 people go through our events online and in person each year. And in the last couple of years, we have positioned ourselves also in the area of internationally funded projects, such as this one that we cooperate with the Sendzimir Foundation. This slide basically says the same thing as the previous one, but in a more catchwords words like advocacy, promotion, certification, education, networking among different stakeholders, and raising the responsibility for green buildings and for our planet. And here you can also see this DGNB system. It's a certification tool. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with it. And just last year we signed a partnership with DGNB, and we are creating our own version of this system for Croatia. I won't talk about the multiple projects that we have. We have currently more than 7 of them, with a lot of new applications being made as we are speaking right now. So hopefully we'll have even more great projects like this that we'll have a chance to implement. We cover a variety of topics, from, of course, heritage buildings, from implementing the levels framework, from using precast concrete, to making sure as well to have energy efficient green communities, to develop a national qualification platform. Again, if you're interested in any of these projects in more details, feel free to talk to me or to go and visit our website for more details. Talking about this wonderful project that we did together, we internally used to call it Clean Build, and we still call it Clean Build because the full name is very long, so I think this saves a bit of time. Later on, we'll also have our own workshop where we will present this national project that was created and brought in Croatia at the end of last year. And we are very happy and proud that this project, Clean Build, was recognized as being very important and relevant one, and it was included in the project of energy renovation for heritage buildings as an example of a very successful international cooperation. So yes, we're very happy that our national ministry recognized this project and included it in this document. Basically, as Evelina said, we did several project activities. We were carrying it out simultaneously in Poland and in Croatia. In Croatia, we did 17 interviews with national stakeholders, and on these slides are just some of the challenges that we came across during the interviews. I'll just talk very briefly about a few of them. Of course, the cost of the energy renovation, not enough coordination among different stakeholders. There are some inconsistency in the conservation requirements. And then, of course, I'll briefly mention also the challenges of earthquakes that we have in Croatia. I'm sure that you're familiar. 2 years ago, we had 2 very strong earthquakes that we are still recovering from. So this topic is very important for us, and our contribution to the publication was with this topic of the earthquakes. 2 more things to briefly mention. We also had 3 city workshops where we had the chance to test the algorithms that were developed by Tomasz. Our participants really enjoyed them, and it's a very useful tool to guide you through the process of renovation. So I'm all inviting you to take a better look at it and to use it in your everyday life. And finally, as we are having this final conference today, we also had a final conference 2 weeks ago in Croatia to officially end the project in Croatia. Here are just a couple of pictures. And in the end, let me also mention that it was mentioned already before, but the publication, it's available in 3 languages. We have printed out versions in Polish and in Croatian. English one is available or will be available very soon. And maybe an interesting data to say is that already since being available online for the last 2 weeks, the Croatian version alone has been downloaded for almost 300 times. So we consider this to be a very nice success. The topic is very interesting, it's very relevant, and once again I want to thank everyone for joining today, and special thanks to Evelina and to Agnieszka, with whom I had the chance to cooperate basically on a daily level for the last 2 years. It was a pleasure. I learned a lot of you regarding project management, regarding this topic, and of course special thanks to Tomasz. Editing publication in one language is quite challenging, but doing it so in 3, it brings additional challenges. I think you managed to do that brilliantly, and that our audience will really enjoy the work that we managed to do together. I'm looking forward to the main speaker and to the rest of the conference. Thank you very much, and I'm here available for all the questions. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy, Aleksander.
Thank you, Alexander. Here we could see contact details. Now we will have a technical break, and after the break, we'll invite Alexandra Troy to the stage.
Okay. Dziękuję za zaproszenie. But I fear very much more is not here. I tried to learn Polish some years ago, but bardzo trudne. So very, very briefly, who am I? I'm an electrical engineer from profession, or from education. I focused on energy in buildings from the very beginning, and I came to that connection, to that interface to heritage with my PhD thesis, which I did on church heating. So you see, the father does not really know how to deal with it, yeah? Actually, it's now nearly 25 years that I have been working at this interface, mainly at Euroag Research in Bolzano. Since 2018, I'm also teaching this subject of simulation building physics at Coburg University. Let's briefly go through some examples, some numbers, which you, I think, know, but maybe it's also more the images which you should look like. We know 40% of energy consumption come from buildings in Europe. 36% of our CO2 emissions come from buildings in Europe. 85% of the buildings we will have in 2050 are built already now. So there is not really a space for new ones. And actually, the renovation rate is, in most cases, below 1%. What you saw with the images is all European cities. I think you perceived, like me, how beautiful they are and how big the variety is. And on the other hand side, we see, if we look at our carbon budget, that if we want not to avoid temperature rise, but to keep it in a bearable limit, we really have to go down very, very sharply in the next years with our carbon emissions. And what does that mean for me also? I think looking at the whole life cycle is crucial at this moment. And I believe that renovating means actually saving during operation, which must much less carbon invested in materials than building a new one. So actually, if we want to really come fast down with carbon emissions, we should renovate, not build new. And I was super happy last year when the Pritzker Prize, which was usually for very creative, very upstage architects and so on, went to Lacaton and Vassal with the motto, never demolish, never remove, always add, transform, reuse. I thought, okay, this is what I really believe. I think it's also a lot of buildings, if we look at them in a bit of a wider definition. This is the inner city of Bologna. In Bologna, we have 60% of the buildings from before 1919 and 80% from before 1945. If we take these two numbers and look a bit of statistics along Europe, you see that actually in quite some countries, and especially also in those with a big building stock, the share is high. Look at UK, look at France, look at Spain, and also Poland, yeah? It's 1/4. And in this 1/4 of the dwellings in Europe, there are actually living people. There are living 100 million Europeans who would like to live there with a good comfort, with paying not too much. And I think it is mainly also people who like living in these buildings. And this is, I think, the key where we should attach, which we should use. I know there are a lot of cases where energy retrofit of historic buildings did go wrong. Yeah, I sometimes can understand heritage authorities if they are skeptical, because I have been shown images, pictures of cases where I say, no, how could they do it? Yeah, but I would like to promote, to show the good examples. I think this is more motivating, this is more triggering, this can help the building owners, the architects, but also the heritage authorities to do it and do it in the right direction. What I would like to show you is, first of all, this HYBER Atlas. HYBER Atlas stands for Historic Building Energy Retrofit Atlas, and it collected or collects good examples. It has grown quite a bit. It's nearly 70 cases we have documented here. And they are documented independent of the level of formal protection. So I think half of them are actually listed buildings. Half of them are buildings where the owners, the architects, perceived a value to be preserved. And also the range of buildings in times of age varies from old buildings, medieval buildings, 1920s, post-Second World War. So you see here just some examples of the variety of buildings which are in. What was the condition for a building to be documented here? First of all, real building. Implemented, done, finished. Not just idea how we would like to have it. Yeah? This is also important, but here we wanted to show implemented. Renovation of the whole building, or at least the ambition at the beginning to do so. Not just PV added, not just heating system changed, not just one aspect, but building as a whole. Then we wanted them to be ambitious from energy point of view. We did not put a limit. I think this depends too much on the single building, but we wanted the approach to be ambitious. And we wanted also that the heritage compatibility did really guide the process, that this was an important factor in the decisions. And then we wanted a minimum of documentation. We first started with, okay, let's look for buildings which are monitored, but that would have limited quite too much. So a minimum of documentation of the technical solutions and, if possible, bills on how it works now. Why did we document it? I think I said that already. We wanted to show good examples in order to trigger, to make people see what is possible. Therefore, also this focus on images, on photos, on experiences, for people to look at it and get inspired. It is a website which has been done in a way that it also quite nicely usable on tablets and mobile phones, so actually you would have this browsing experience. And I would go with you a little bit through it just to show you how it was done. This is one building in the Alps, in the Dolomites, which I go now through as an example. You have here usually in the first part quite some key figures, a teaser, some first images. What was the energy performance reached? Is it a listed building? How big is it? You can click here on more. You will get a bit of more experience description. And then the next part looks at the architecture, looks at what is there, what is the potential of the buildings, what are the nice parts, what are also the elements worth of preservation. And again, it looks at it brings a number of buildings just to show to who is browsing through and give an idea on what could be reached. After that, there is one part missing, which we don't see here. Between the architecture and the retrofit solutions, there is one part which describes the concept, which the team then finally decided to follow. And there is one part which talks about the experience, so specific experiences, lessons learned. And I thought about that when you were talking about the practical experiences and how difficult it might be, and that you need the local support, you need the local craftsmen and so on. These kind of experiences were actually often documented there. Then it goes actually to the solutions. And we tried to explain them usually in two parts, two paragraphs. One paragraph, what was done, and the second paragraph, why was it feasible? Was it a good solution in that case? You might not just take the solution and say in every other building this is fine, but if you understand why in this building it was fine, you can much better evaluate whether your building would also be suited for this solution. Also here you would get some more details if you click on it. You have more pictures, usually, if we managed also from the construction phase to give you an idea how the whole thing is done. And then, of course, it is not only about walls, it is also windows which are documented, it is interventions on the roof, ground floor, measures to increase the airtightness, it is on the building system, on integration of renewables. And the whole thing finally closes with some key figures, key numbers, energy use, energy performance, is there monitoring, how was the result on indoor air quality, and so on. There's also one chapter on life cycle assessment, which unfortunately up to now is seldomly filled. So there is, what we saw, not that much experience. A lot of interest. I think it will grow a lot in the next years, but not yet so much numbers to show. How can you use it? when we programmed the site, the programmers asked that, why do you want search functions? Why do you want filters? Why do you want maps? We had 5 cases, yeah? So the 5 cases were easy just to decide by looking at this first site. But now I think we have a number where actually all these functions are fine. There is this search function where you can use search with a keyword. There is the filter where you can actually filter according to a number of specific fields, be it on whether it is listed or not, the country, the climate, focus on solutions, what has been done, and so on. And then finally, the map, where you can browse into. What you see here is that those who filled in the cases up to now came on the one hand side from Task 59, which was an international project, and from the Atlas project, which was an alpine space project. Therefore, this concentration in the Alps. But actually, the whole thing was done in order to live also after these 2 projects now have closed, which means that everybody should now be able to contribute to that atlas. It has been done in a way that with a bit of guidance, any architect can feed in. And and therefore the question to you, if you know a good example, get in touch with us. There is also from Task 59, from the International Energy Agency's Solar Heating and Cooling Program, different reports. One is specifically on these case study collections, where you then can find things like the short description of the cases. You see here that there is a kind of brief review process for cases to be published. The review does not have the aim to kind of block cases, but it has the aim to help document well. So there is both one with technical background and one with heritage background, proofreading, giving feedback to the author of a case study before it is published. What you see also is then some statistics on the single interventions, on what was reached. I just point out one here. You see, this is the energy demand before the intervention. This is the energy demand after the intervention. So I think in the cases we have we show here, it was actually effective. In the task, we had also a second part where we looked specifically at solutions, and we were thinking quite a while on how to make them available. And finally, we decided that we would like not just to publish them, a book where you read from A to Z, but also kind of guide the user to find the right ones. I think this is very, very similar to your decision trees, yeah? You have done a very similar thing, and maybe we can combine the two in a second moment. Let's discuss that. So you see here, for example, walls. Then you go through a number of questions, and you get a PDF with a short summary. And if there is a case study in the Hyper Atlas which features just that solution, there is also a link back to the Hyper Atlas. Let's look at some of the cases. So at the moment, for windows, for walls, for ventilation, for solar, this has been implemented. Before we go into the windows, I would, however, try to give you a brief input from our history on window research. We actually started in the 3&Cult project with developing a new conservation-compatible window. So we had a window fitter, a small window fitter from France, who walked through Bolzano with our heritage authority. So they were talking to each other. The small window fitter was super experienced in passive house windows. And what came out was a window which actually met passive house criteria, but was also acceptable for our heritage authority. And you see it here. It kind of, especially the version with the thin glazing, really is, from the point of view of the frame and of the whole dimension, it meets what you need for a heritage building. For the case of the WAG house, this was a good solution. In the WAG house, the original buildings had windows had already been lost. Of course, if you have original windows there, you would like to avoid to throw them out. On the other hand side, especially if it is single windows, U value around 5, that's a lot of energy which you lose. Then in Italy, with our small windows, maybe the overall loss is not so big. But I think if I think about Scotland, with all these huge window buildings, this makes really a difference. So actually, we were looking also at window retrofits, and we tried to understand the different levels of intervention which you can have, from very minimum intervention to exchanging a window. And you see here a bit of a variety of cases which we looked at, which we also documented. And what we saw in the last year, I'm not sure whether you have heard about that super bonus in Italy. You can get 110% funding for an energy retrofit, but you have to show that you have an ambitious intervention, which for a heritage building might be difficult. For windows, it would mean in our climate zone reach an U value of 1.0. And with the retrofit of the box-type windows, we quite easily reach 1.2, 1.1, but this last step to 1.0 was really difficult. I think I go a bit faster through here. These were things we were doing together with local craftsmen on the one hand side, and with... no, one was missing, yeah. It's like that. Okay, I wanted to show you my own building, but maybe it comes afterwards. We go on, in that case, with the walls. Also for walls, before we look... for the windows, I wanted actually to go briefly to the tool itself. So actually, just to show you, if I click here, the question would be, which kind of window do you want to refurbish or recreate? Let's say we have a box-type window. And we make it a bit smaller so that... Keyboards are all different. Let's say, okay, we have a box-type window. We would be able to change the appearance, or maybe we would be able to change the appearance from inside. We should keep the appearance outside, but we could do something inside. Then the next question would be whether... No, I think now I skipped one. So I already said that impact from appearance from inside is fine. Now I could say, okay, I could replace the inner glass. I could add a layer of glass. I could replace the sashes or window layer, or I could add a solar shading inside. Let's look at this replacing the inner sash or in the window layer. If I go here, I would, for example, get this example here with a description in terms of PDF, which describes the solution, why does it work, the description of the context, an example. And on the other hand side, it links you back to a case study where this has actually been implemented, which would in that case be a building in, oops, this was wrong, a building in Vienna. And you could then go here to the retrofit solution, and you could see the description of what was done on the window, with different images and drawings explaining how and what was done. Okay, let's go back to the presentation and start with the walls. If I talk about walls, I'm not sure how many architects are in the audience. Yeah, quite some. Okay, then it should be fine. Very often, and we can look at the different example afterwards in the hybrid tool, but usually insulating walls in heritage buildings will mean do interior insulation. And what does interior insulation mean? I would always like to communicate it is a good solution. Yeah, there's a small but. The but is because as soon as you insulate from inside, your original wall will be cold. Yeah, and what happens now if vapor passes through your insulation? It will condensate in that point. Now you have mainly two options to deal with that. On the one hand side, you could have a material which is capillary active. What does that mean? it has, it lets vapor pass. It has, however, also the capacity to store. So you have a sorption curve, which says at which relative humidity, how much vapor can be stored, can be taken up by the material. And it can transport liquid water. So it kind of can suck the water, once it is condensated, back, and it can dry out again towards the inside. Vapor in winter would never move from that point to the inside. Vapor in our climate goes always from inside to outside. But the water can be transported back to the room. This is the mechanism of such a capillary active material. The other solution, and here it moves. The other solution could be that you actually avoid that the vapor goes into the construction. You can have this with a vapor barrier, which you add, which might be a single foil, or you have the whole material vapor tight. This is the other option. In that case, of course, you avoid or at least limit very much the vapor which goes to the cold part, and you avoid the problem this way. There is one second drawback I would like to mention. This is humidity in the wall does not only come from the room. It could also come from driving rain on the wall, and it could come from below in the wall. If you have a vapor-tight solution or a vapor barrier solution, it means that all this water has to dry out toward outside, because towards the inside it cannot go. While if you have a capillary active insulation system, it's easier to deal with this situation. So that means if you have a vapor barrier solution, you should be sure that you have a driving rain-tight surface outside. This means you would usually verify whether the solution you thought about does work. Most of the standards and easier tools for architects to calculate U values and so on do also do a first verification from that point of view. But these usually just look at how vapor moves. This is fine for the solution with a vapor barrier, because the main concept is done. And the second advantage is you just need to know the mu value. And this is something you can find on the datasheet of the materials. But with these calculus, you would not see the capillary effect. Yeah? You could, of course, choose in the database a capillary active material, but the program will not consider that the material can transport liquid water. It will not consider that it can store. So it would look as if it was worse than it is. Yeah? If you really want to simulate, to see, to verify for a capillary active material, you have to do a dynamic hygrothermal simulation. And in that case, you need more information on the material, unfortunately. You need to know about absorption, you need to know about the liquid transport, and all these are not anymore single numbers you find in a data sheet, but these are curves. Very, very briefly, an outlook to science. It's not only us, I think there are also other labs throughout Europe who do that, but we have a lab where we actually can do these measurements. We can characterize the materials, and we combine this with numerical simulation and on-site monitoring. This is how the lab looks like. You see the different materials. You see this is where you measure the mu value. This is where we measure the lambda value. This is where we measure the water uptake. This is where we measure the drying coefficient of the materials. And these things are where we measure the absorption curves. So it's a lot of work to be done. I think, however, it's worthwhile to do. You get these raw data. You have then the curves. And you can actually predict what happens within a construction, within a component. And this allows you then to see that, on the one hand side, which temperature profile you might have within the wall, and also which humidity profile you might have. And what you see here is, this is interior insulation, this is the wall. Here it is cold in winter, and therefore here the humidity is high. And here outside, this is the rain. So the rain will lead to wet areas here. this is mainly coming from inside, maybe a bit influenced on how wet the wall gets via the rain. Actually, our local certifier added to their energy calculation at least a 1D tool in order to do these hygrothermal simulations, because they say we will have a lot of interior insulation in future, not only in historic buildings, but in a lot of multifamily buildings, so on. We want our designers to be aware and to do the respective calculations. And this is then a case of a monitoring where we actually wanted to see, okay, we calculate, and of course we engineers always believe that what we calculate is fine, but then we also want to show that what we calculate is fine. And what we see here is that actually we can reproduce what we measure with simulations quite well. So if you do the simulation the right way, of course you have to think what you do, but then you actually can get a good agreement with reality. For the again I would have forgotten. I wanted to, of course, show you also one of the examples in the tool. If we go in here, so I think in your case it would be mainly solid walls. You don't have that much of timber frame in Poland, right? So let's go in here for the solid walls. Let's maybe first look at what the Hyper tool would propose if we say the external finish is not necessarily worthy of preservation. There can be several situations where you can have this situation. On the one hand side, no, let's go to the exterior insulation. As far as I remember, they had quite some different examples here. On the one hand side here, this was a case in Vienna with aerogel high-performance insulating plaster system, so easier to keep the proportions, but still have a good performance. Then a case where you also might be able to do something outside is if you have shingles, if you have a facade where actually you can put something behind the layer. And insulating from outside avoids this cold wall problem. So if you have a chance, do that. Yeah. Or there was an example with vacuum panels. This would be a typical situation. You might have a backside of your building. Maybe the front side is where you cannot insulate from outside, but the back side, yes. Use all these possibilities. Yeah. That's what I wanted to show. And then, of course, you could go back and could also look to the interior insulation solutions. If you say at the very beginning that your external finish is worthy of preservation. For the ventilation, I actually would like to guide you through an example. Ventilation, I'm not sure how it is in Poland. My experience with the international project is there are countries where it is very common. There are countries where people think this is a luxury. Yeah, this is not something for a common house. And when we looked at the, again, Public Way House, which was the case study in Thrienkalp, we were in the situation, thanks a lot, that actually the architect had the feeling, I would like to avoid it. It worked until now. I have a lot of cases where it works also without. And the situation was more or less that we saw, okay, what you can do in that building. Roof insulation, that's fine. Then we could do insulation of the ceilings, above the portici, of the ground and the cellar. Windows, as you saw, were already exchanged, so actually new and better ones would have been a good idea. And ventilation system in the under the roof would have been an option, because there's some meeting rooms, new meeting room should have been integrated, and in the cafeteria at the ground floor. But he would have liked to not to work on the other two floors. With these measures, we can reduce the energy demand by 40%. And we have not insulated the walls because actually the conservators told us we have original plaster inside and outside. It should not only be preserved, but also remain the perceivable surface. So we actually tried to go in that direction. If we now do not do a ventilation system, this is a higher energy demand. Of course, we don't have heat recovery, but we could decide that this is fine. What we actually feared is that we could have higher humidity levels because people might not ventilate enough. And if we now have higher humidity levels inside, we have the wall which is not insulated. On the other hand side, we have windows which are new, and new windows will always be airtight. So we feared that there could be a hygrothermal risk and wanted to have a look at it. We did the calculation with the quantum model, which kind of takes every room, understands how this room interacts with the exterior. You can also tell the system different ways how you that the ventilation is done. It can be a mechanical ventilation, but it can also be window ventilation, and it takes always the temperature differences inside outside to understand actually which air exchange you have. Because if you open a window in winter with 0 degrees outside, 20 inside, you have much more air change than if you open it in summer, where maybe, or spring, where you have 18 outside, 22 inside. Yeah, all these things are can be calculated, can be quantified. And what we saw here is we had 3 options. We first thought, okay, option A, people open the windows during the lunch break, they tilt them. 45 minutes during lunch break, a bit open. B, they open them additionally in the morning and in the late afternoon before leaving. And 3, we have an active overflow ventilation system, so actually a kind of low impact ventilation system implemented. What you see here on the left side is which CO2 level do we get in single areas. Gray means bad comfort, yeah? And then it goes until blue, which would be category 1 quality. This was not the main issue there, but it is already a first hint on what does it mean for air exchange, and humidity is most probably related to it. We see that with the with the higher ventilation, especially in the late afternoons, we were already in a not so bad situation, but of course good it was only with an active overflow. What you see here is actually the humidity, which we will have over the whole period, and you see that standard-wise I would expect 50%, and I would calculate for 50%. We see here that with that ventilation system, we might have considerable times with higher relative humidities. So what we calculated would be fine might in practice not be fine. Yeah, and that's what we then tried to. The green parts here you see, as soon as you ventilate enough, these periods get much, much lower, and with active overflow, we don't at least go beyond 50%. And if we now look at some points where actually the temperature is particularly cold, which would be these angles in the wall, for example, where we would have 9.7 degrees. I think I don't go into very detail in these numbers here, but we see that we would be on the safe side actually only if we guarantee a good ventilation. And the ventilation could be both B, so the window ventilation, which is done in a proper way, or it can be a mechanical ventilation system. For me, that meant a bit, or showed a bit, that maybe we can argue a little bit about energy demand, even if here, if we say, okay, carbon budget, it is as it is, maybe we cannot anymore argue that much. But we can definitely not argue about mold risk, yeah? We definitely want to avoid any mold risk in the buildings. And therefore, our strong recommendation was to guarantee ventilation in that case. In an office building, relying on people ventilating, I'm not sure whether it will work. Because if I think about myself leaving the office in the afternoon, would I take the time to 15 minutes ventilate? But of course, maybe for other uses, this is still possible. We are actually discussing at URAC these days whether we should go out in our area with a bit of recommendations for this winter. I fear that people this winter will not ventilate enough. I fear we will have a lot of mold problems because people do not heat certain rooms. Those remain cold. The humidity anyway will distribute, and we will have in the cold rooms, which are not ventilated, mold issues. So ventilation, be it via a system or be it via a thought window ventilation, I think is really crucial. One last point on ventilation, I think if you have a ventilation system with heat recovery, one point might be that you can work with a slide under pressure. If you have a slide under pressure, you avoid humid air from the room in any cracks you might have to go into the wall. So also from that point of view, avoiding condensation, a ventilation system could also help you. And as regards the solar, I think I would also just go into the database a bit and look with you at different cases. Here the cases came actually also at least a bit from one more project, which was an Interreg Italy-Switzerland case, which was called BIPV, so Building Integrated Photovoltaics Meets History. And we were looking for examples. So let's, for example, start, okay, can renewables be installed on the roof? Let's start with yes. And look at, for example, something which is integrated. Then we do have a number of cases which you can browse through. And again, in each of the cases, you would have a PDF which shows you a bit what has been, this describes it in a short text, and you have the link back to the cases where it was implemented. What I understood is that with the new technologies, with the new colors which are available, much more things become possible. I was now looking for one case I had in mind I saw yesterday. Where is that? A very old installation. I don't see it now. The one in Edinburgh. I must have entered differently yesterday. What a pity. Okay, because in Edinburgh, they actually had the situation to use a space. So the roof has quite an M shape. So actually, you had two surfaces which you could in theory use. Then, of course, only one is probably in the right direction. But still, this was a case already 20 years ago where PV was installed. While I think nowadays, we do have materials where actually we can also work on surfaces which are visible if it is done in a way which is aesthetically acceptable. And what I perceive also is that from heritage authority point of view, there is more openness. They actually were involved also in the Ticino-Lombardia area, and it was also a question from the heritage authorities to understand how can it be done today, yeah? What could be possible? And they explained what would be our condition, how has it to be in order to be acceptable? While actually, when our own authorities in Bolzano knew about the project, there was a big, big fear. What are they doing? They are promoting, Hilfe, yeah? On the other hand side, for example, Germany, my colleague Franziska from the ICOMOS, who's also president of ICOMOS ISCAS, has been invited several times in podium discussions where actually the issue is discussed. So I see a new openness, and I saw, for example, when I was in the city of Einbeck, we were working with students on the building there. We were making several proposals. Then actually in the discussion came out, okay, if it is something which would be, for example, small pieces like tiles, it would be easier acceptable than big sheets, yeah? And the fact that they don't have anymore to be shiny, they can be quite opaque, is also helping to have a PV integrated in a good way. Okay, and I actually would like to close more or less with a small video, which is, sorry, I hope that I would avoid it. Yes, I can, sorry. We just started from here. Whoops.
This is my home. I remember when I was a child, and I used to play hide and seek behind its walls. I would choose a spot and stay hidden for hours, watching the clouds pass by, listening to the crackling sound of the logs burning. I stared at the woodwork of the ceiling so often I know it by heart. Time has not been kind to this building. Cracks, drafts, and moisture have made it more and more unpleasant to live in. But then I discovered the Atlas project. From dozens of examples, I was able to choose the best renovation solutions
with
for a house
project.
like mine. I can tell you, it is not easy to refurbish a building whose history goes back centuries. Most importantly, the project helped me select the right professionals to carry out the renovation works. This allowed me to not only save my home, but also to make it more efficient and sustainable. Better for me, for the Alps, and for the planet. Thanks to Atlas, I learned that preserving my home means so much more than I had first thought. It means protecting our cultural heritage, our common roots. This is my home. This is where my family has been living for generations, and where it will live for many more.
And as I said, I think we can exchange Atlas with the project you had here in Poland. And I think this is our chance, that people actually see and like the buildings they're living in. And if they are guided, we will manage to reconcile climate change mitigation with cultural heritage preservation. Not sure whether you foresee also time for questions, Evelina? Okay, I hope I was not too long.
Nie wiem, jest tłumaczenie, może będzie lepiej jednak po polsku, będę bardziej precyzyjnie mówić.
I'm going to speak Polish.
Też uwzględniano trochę kwestii
Did the project also account for biodiversity?
Chociażby to, że w tych starych budynkach
Did the project account for biodiversity?
So maybe I'll try English, however, it's not perfect. And działa teraz? Can you hear the translation?
Can you now hear me, please?
Okay, maybe I ask it in English. Can you deal with this project also with some problems of biodiversity? Because very often these old historical monuments are inhabited by owls, rats, bats, and so on, or was it only technical matters?
It was mainly technical matters. I don't come across.
Can you please remove your headset? I can hear interference. Thank you.
It was mainly technical. I can't remember one of the cases where actually biodiversity played a role. I agree with you. This is for sure also an issue. We did not tackle it here. What you find documented in the cases is usually social impacts. What it meant for the people to renovate it, what was important for them, and these things. This is included.
Are there any aspects of problems of people with disabilities or not? So what is, was it a wide range of problems or?
It was not the focus. Okay. It was not the focus, no. I think in some it has been anyway reported. Maybe next to the technical issues, mainly the process, the decision process was documented, this yes. And there, in part, maybe also accessibility was a topic. But yeah, I fear it was narrow. So there is a lot, lot still to do.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question about, you mentioned about isolation method, aerogel for the outside of walls. Did you happen to know the case when it is used in the inside? And did you know maybe some results of analysis or how it works for better ventilation of historical buildings?
If you have aerogel in an insulation and the inside, I think it works similar to outside. Yeah, you can have an insulation plaster with aerogel also inside, and you just need less thickness for the same effect. So it is better than a standard insulation plaster. We had within the Ephesus, you could find documented a case where actually an aerogel-based insulation system was blown into a cavity. That might also be interesting. But in that case, for example, from a vapor point of view, it would behave like mineral wool. So vapor could pass. You would have to think about vapor solutions. And I would not see a direct link between an aerogel insulation and the ventilation of the building. So these are two separate things.
Do you find this method that it's better than standard isolation from the inside? I mean, thick layer and then ventilation gap, and
maybe you have to explain me better
in Polish,
where you see the ventilation issue. Maybe Thomas, you know what she has in mind?
The ventilation gap is between the original wall and the new insulation wall.
Okay. I think there, if it is an insulation plaster, you won't have that gap because you just apply it on the full surface as a plaster. So you avoid that. The blow-in insulation would have the same issue like other insulation systems, that you have to make sure that you have an airtight connection. So I did not mention that in my presentation. You're right. One thing is the vapor which passes through the insulation system, and this is usually little. As soon as you have any cracks, any open parts, and air from the inside can come behind the insulation, this is worst case, yeah? This is really something you have to avoid. This is super important that craftsmen are aware of the importance of working with, in that case, airtight connections. Good that you mentioned it.
Thank you for the presentation, that's first. And then I wanted to ask if the proposed solutions considered the CO2 footprint of materials. I mean, if the materials proposed as solutions are natural based, and was it considered in the calculations?
We were collecting implemented cases and so in the Hyper Atlas with the whole building presentations, I think we have 2 or 3 in the whole Hyper Atlas which did an LCA analysis. There we know also about the material impact and can make comparisons. For the Hyper tool, where we looked specifically at solutions, it was, I fear, not a specific topic. What I would say from my experience is that usually talking to heritage authorities or to people in the heritage scene, if you use materials which are wood-based, you have more open ears, because this is more similar to what has been used as a material in these buildings over a long time. So actually here, 2 good things come together.
Miejsce jeszcze na jedno pytanie.
We have time for one more question. Do we have any volunteers to ask the final question? If not, I would like to thank Alexandra.
Your presentation and inspirations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Poproszę jeszcze raz brawa. A ja teraz zapraszam na...
Now I would like our panel speakers to join the floor. Małgorzata Borys, Adam Wojtalik. Of the 5 architects group. Now she usually explores the retrofit and revitalization or reclamation of buildings, accounting for sustainability and social aspects. You participated in renovating the railway station in Wrocław, also the Piast breweries in Wrocław, as well as a number of conservation projects in Warsaw and Łódź, as well as the so-called Green Market Square project in Kielce. Adam Wojtalik is also an architect and the co-author of a number of public utility buildings. He is now representing, for purpose of this panel, the Łódź Infrastructure Company. He is part of the investment department. Now, the scope of the company itself focuses on the construction, renovation, or other renovation works on buildings forming part of the heritage or historical buildings list. You also part of administration tasks. Now, Adam, let me start with you. Given the current times of the climate crisis, whereby we have to adapt to it, we have to get used to it, and also reduce the human impact on the environment, among others, by abating the CO2 emissions. And on the other hand, we have Łódź, a city full of historical buildings and existent buildings requiring modernization. You, as the Łódź Infrastructure Company, I'm sorry, interpreting is becoming well nigh impossible because of the feedback and because of the lack of proper sound. Let me begin by telling you that we are working on climate in times of climate crisis. I'm sorry, the sound quality has deteriorated to an extent, preventing the option to interpret. Interpreting services will resume once you deal with the problem.
zdegradowane, że musimy. Więc tutaj tak naprawdę dużą rolę odgrywają wszelkiego rodzaju ekspertyzy, badania i to tak naprawdę analiza wstępna, która dotyczy tych budynków. I dzięki temu też, że jesteśmy jednocześnie inwestorem i projektantem i potem zarządzającym tymi budynkami, to możemy odpowiedzieć na wiele pytań już na samym początku. Jakby cały proces projektowy jest dużo prostszy, ponieważ
Now the entire project process is much better. The decision-making process has been reduced just to a few persons, so we can design with future users in mind, and we usually learn more about the users on the go. Now, public utility building users, mainly office building users, should be known to the contractor as well. We have BREEAM certificates and other certificates, which obviously means that we have to account for the crisis, and the crisis means that we have to move forward. Now, as a result, quite a few people have begun identifying the problem, people focusing on commercial buildings, which means that it has become much easier to talk to people.
Instytucjami, ale jakby w gronie osób, które zajmują się na co dzień.
But in the group of people who manage and build buildings, it's much easier to discuss it and to come to conclusions. So you touched upon a lot of aspects, and you talked about taking decision-making process. It is also very important when this decision-making process is functions better, then the implementation of the project also goes smoother. Małgosia, what are your experiences and what are the rules in your designing work that you follow when you design for the buildings that are already there, that are the existing buildings? For us, the dialogue is the most important thing. It was mentioned several times today. So meeting at one table, talking to each other is very important, and what we did during the workshops. In the room, designers from different industries, building preservation specialists and other stakeholders met in one room, and we were able to discuss the most important issues in terms of thermal retrofitting of building and revitalization of building. And another thing is questioning the knowledge that we have all the time, verifying our knowledge, and checking if the solutions that we apply on a daily basis are the best ones. So we have to ask ourselves this question all over again, why we do that and why don't we try a different solution? Yes, Tomasz also mentioned that. When we started working on our book, we found that there is not much material on it. So the buildings that you deal with are very individual cases, and actually these were quite old buildings with very specific requirements. How do you overcome this challenge? When you want to introduce all of these ecological solutions, which are not very easy to implement, you have to take into consideration different aspects, for example, the physics of the construction, or the historical value of the building. How do you succeed in convincing different people to change their approach to the more ecological one? From my perspective, it is easy because a lot of those issues just result in decrease of costs. So the investment costs are there, but then the operating costs are much lower. So it is easy to convince people that they will pay less. And the other aspect is the national heritage, but also the legacy that we will leave behind us.
rodzicielstwa dla budynków,
So we have to be aware parents of our buildings, but aware parents of our children as well. We want our children to live in a better world in the future. That is why a lot of people decide to make the change at home or installing photovoltaic panels, collectors, heat pumps, or people give up meat, and people give up all different kind of things that we were used to for years. And they change their approach to the more ecological ones. Yes, and this holistic approach really makes sense. We discussed different methods of building insulation, but when I take a look at a given window, then I see it in different aspects, in different dimensions. So on the one hand, this is a monument, but on the other hand, it is also an element of identity of people who crafted this window 100 or 200 years ago. But on the other hand, this is also an element of the structure which influences its energy performance. And it also can insulate us from the noise. And actually, noise level decreasing is an element that is taken into account more and more often. But also thermal insulation is of huge importance here. This all aspects pertain to windows. So I have to think about this window as an element of the structure of the building that is to be more energy neutral. We are also talking about passive architecture or even primitive architecture. There we want to reuse what is already there. We can see here one of the examples of a building in wood. We know that we can use the materials that are already there in the building. When we are talking about wood, then there are a lot of backyards in the terraced structure. And actually there are some places there that may be cool because the sun rays don't reach those places. And it also is connected with the fact of the existence of the heat islands, urban heat islands. So we need to think about it, how to design our backyards in order for the sun to reach all of the corners of our backyard. So this is everything that we have to think about before designing the building, before building it, actually. It is all related with physics. But actually it is no rocket science. And so what we do, we start from scratch. We start from photovoltaic panels, and then our next projects implement next elements, and we are adding subsequent elements to our projects from going from one project to the other. But we always want to be aware while designing our buildings. We want to decrease CO2 emissions, etc. Thank you very much. You will be able to see more examples on the screen. You also talked about a holistic approach to designing buildings, and you also talked about national heritage and the usage of national heritage in the context of energy performance and energy efficiency. So finding a common denominator of all those aspects and combining it is very difficult sometimes. Małgosia, what is your experience in this respect? Well, when it comes to investors who are then the owners and the users of the buildings, in a longer perspective, it's easier to discuss with them. But it's more difficult to convince investors who just renovate buildings and then only sell them to the buyers. So they are not using the buildings, they will not benefit from the fact that those buildings will be, for example, less energy consuming. So the discussion with those investors is more difficult, but then the awareness of the society comes to the rescue. Our society has become more and more aware on the climate change, on increasing temperatures, and they are also aware of the fact that we have to do something about our planet so that our children can live happily in it. And this is taken into account by investors because they can use it in their marketing. We can use the social awareness in convincing the investors. You're both architects. How do you evaluate the climate awareness among architects, among investors? And where do you derive your inspirations from? We as architects, as a social group, we are knowledgeable. When it comes to new buildings, then yes, for sure, we know what to do. When we design buildings from scratch, we know what to do. It's a bit more difficult when we try to renovate the existing buildings. I think that there is this gap in the knowledge concerning the physics of the building, of the construction. When we talk in our construction teams, architects think that the sanitary installators will deal with a certain issue, and sanitary installators say that no, it's not our responsibility, it's your responsibility. So I'm waiting for a moment in time when we will have a person in the team who will manage this division of responsibilities. Now we have already started cooperating with acoustic specialists, sound specialists, and I hope that at one point the physicists specializing in buildings will be also part of the team. Do you have in your company a building physicist? No, not yet. We are basing our actions on our own knowledge, so sometimes it is challenging, but we are basing also on the rules which are not new to us. We know those rules, they are the same since tens of years, and sometimes it's enough to open an Excel spreadsheet and calculate certain things in 1 minute. We have to create certain tools, and sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's more difficult. Recalculating certain indicators is easy to us, but when it comes to the parameters of the construction physics, freezing of the building, it all requires a bit more of knowledge. It's more difficult, but we always have to remember about the opportunity of using the knowledge of others, using the know-how of the professionals who deal with that issues on a daily basis. So I am a specialist in architecture, but I try to learn about the world as much as possible. We shouldn't be focused only on our narrow field of specialization, but we have to broaden our horizons so that we can do our job better. And actually, cities are very specific. We know very little about, for example, fauna and flora living in the cities, and we also have to take them into consideration while designing buildings. Accessibility is another aspect we have to remember about. So I know that the awareness in the society and among architects is rising. And also our industry also welcomes new notions when we are talking about grey water, but greenwashing, it also entered our glossaries, so we can see that our knowledge of technologies is rising.
Thank you very much for that. You, Małgosia, also mentioned the concept of convincing others through the prism of economic and financial profit once a renovation project is complete. I would like to point out that what you can see on the screen now is one of the interiors of the Łódź infrastructure company. So can I ask you questions concerning about solutions applied in the interior, and also have you been using arguments and basing on arguments concerning the comfort of use and improved quality of life? Well, I would answer in the affirmative. Nonetheless, I am very much aware that this is not necessarily common practice. Everybody thinks that ventilation, for example, is a very specialized notion, whereas the physics of the building is based on the physics of the world. Every building involves processes affecting our health, among others. This is why this particular example is specifically important. It shows a historical interior which was actually developed 100% with polychromy. Now, I would like to change the way of thinking. I would like to reverse the conservation mindset. I am absolutely a great fan of preservation-based conservation in account for costs. Now, wherever we can bring the fabric out and clean it up and show the original nature and character of the building, I don't think it makes any sense to increase the cost of the investment itself. Money is hard to come by these days, not to mention the carbon footprint, because you have to use much more material, and other solutions are much more labor-consuming in order to see the interior in its full glory. Now, obviously, this was a conservation requirement, that ceilings that have in any way been preserved be reconstructed and restored 100%. Obviously, we could well try and discuss it. Yes, it is always an issue of negotiation. When it comes to quality of life, I carry an internal mission within. Now, those are case studies from Mam Architecci, this particular studio. I am inclined to engage in grassroots work. Everybody knows that we need to insulate walls and replace windows and apply PV. Nonetheless, ventilation has remained something of a taboo. People approach us telling us that, there's mold, for example, and then when we talk about ventilation, everybody is kind of, staring at us. Not here, obviously, because everybody present here is well aware of what it is all about. But when I talk to people who have nothing to do with the construction industry whatsoever, they don't know what I'm talking about. I really have to go on talking and talking to install ventilation valves and systems in windows. And the people keep coming back with the same topic, say, and telling me, the window seller told me that I don't need that. I don't need the ventilation component. So people are really obstinate. During one of the workshops, one of the colleagues suggested that possibly people ought to have humidity meters installed in their homes, and once people are aware and can see for themselves what is going on, they are going to opt for ventilation systems. Yes, indeed, this aspect actually was present throughout the training sessions. So I believe that ties in with educating future residential space users. Do you actually do that with your future users? Not yet. But as said before, we are working at the grassroots level. We are constantly evolving, so in all probability, the solutions we are applying now are going to change completely over the next 2 or 3 years. The specificity of our buildings and of our work does not require that. I would like to go back to the backyards, which are cool in the summer. In cases of other plots, we can take advantage of the fact that we have a large garden at our disposal. We can can construct retention tanks for precipitation water, rainwater tanks, in order to preserve the existing greenery, which is of huge importance to the surroundings, which ultimately means that each and every building, each and every garden, each and every plot may be totally different. We can imagine that there are huge differences between townhouses and workers' projects in terms of insulation, in terms of material used, because these buildings have been owned by different classes, respectively. 19th century capitalism operated under specific conditions, which also affected the construction industry, depending on the owner. Knowledge of history is hugely important, because then you find out what it is that you're dealing with. Knowledge is not necessarily based on construction textbooks. It is very important to remember how things evolved, what kind of materials were used, what kind of minorities used individual buildings. And this also obviously leads us to the question who built specific buildings, in which Russian, Germans, and Jews were actually constructing the majority of the buildings. Poles had very little to say on the matter, which means that you have to refer and reference that particular experience in order not to commit mistakes. Do you believe that working with a conservator helps in this matter or not? Well, yes and no. As said before, we are very much in favor of our local wood conservator, because that particular authority is open to discussion. You can take a walk around the building, you can discuss what it is that you intend to do, and talk about your original idea. Nonetheless, administrative issues, issuing decisions, well, maybe not decisions, but recommendations, but well, there are obviously certain solutions embedded in the administrative proceedings code. Nonetheless, there are certain administrative recommendations. I would be hard-pressed to mention specific cases. I remember that the record-breaking case spanned 2 years to wait for recommendations, and I remember that I think the fast-track version was 2 months. At least this is what my practice tells me. That is unquestionably a key component, as it ultimately affects the final form of the building. As an architect, albeit having studied history of art and history of architecture, I have considerably lesser knowledge of history of architecture than people who are historical building conservation alumni or graduates, which means that we have to work together to put together any kind of reasonable conservation plan, which makes a lot of sense given these particular investments. Therefore, I believe that the main problem lies with organizational matters and with the lack of possibility of being precise about the time span. The aforesaid recommendations affect the schedule, the cost, and investment preparations greatly. We are definitely going to be talking about solutions making our lives easier in terms of works in existent buildings, specifically historical buildings. I understand that one of your postulates would be for administrative works to be embedded within some kind of time frame. Yes, but centralizing all decisions of merit, of substance, would be of huge importance. For example, let us consider the openness of European conservators to PV arrays. Poland is much less open to it. Sometimes you do get a permit to use PVs, at other times you do not. It goes without saying that with regard to energy saving and energy generation, that is the simplest solution. We have to use solar energy. Otherwise, we are going to be going on wasting thermal energy, solar energy that could be put to very, very good use. This is why it seems to me that this is less of information, more of a postulate to those to the powers that be. I think that certain guidelines ought to be introduced top-down, because they are important on a global scale, well, on a local, regional, national and global scale, which means that the general conservator, whoever he or she might be, ought to be 2 steps ahead of whatever is going on the market. Małgosia, would you care to add anything to what has been said in terms of a postulate, for example, with regard to working with conservators? It would be great if we could actually have a regular conversation with conservators. Architects or investors should not be perceived as vandals from the word go. We should work together to put all these methods together, because I believe that working together can produce the effect of introducing great solutions for all buildings concerned. Furthermore, it would be great if the owners of historical buildings, largely cities and local governments, begin seeing them as valuable. It is common knowledge that negligence is often the direct results of deficit in funding. Nonetheless, private investors ought to be encouraged to invest in cultural heritage in sustainable ways, whereas investors willing to invest in historical buildings actually walks away from the project at square one. Why? Because they realize what kind of bureaucratic path they will have to manage, and if they are not aware, then they come and talk to me and I tell them what they should expect. Nonetheless, this means that local governments, municipal authorities ought to lead investors by the hand in order for such investors to be welcomed with open arms as partners, as the harbingers of change, of improvement to existent buildings. And I think that this can be done by opening doors, by making life easier, by explaining, because the lack of knowledge, the lack of information, and the procedure that people find daunting, especially if they want to invest in historical fabric, is really, really discouraging. Thank you very much for that. Any questions from the floor? The mic, please. Justyna Glusman, I have had the pleasure of managing sustainable development of the capital city of Warsaw for a while. You told us that municipal authorities could help investors. How could the city become a middleman, if you will, between the investor and the conservator? Well, Warsaw's situation is tragic. Professor Lewicki, the great unwashed and the great absent, is a tragic choice for the chief conservator of the city of Warsaw. He is incompetent, without proper education in the field. So I do realize that what we need is a structural reform of the system. Moreover, we cannot base on the goodwill and or competencies of a single individual, because those decisions in Warsaw are not transparent. I know that other countries have introduced other solutions, so possibly that is a question to you guys. A commission that, with a membership of representatives of conservation services and architects and local government, could, in all probability, provide sound assessment of architectural options, they would, in all probability, have to vote in full transparency, taking local residents into account. I know that such system has been implemented in Berlin. I know that the UK have done quite a bit in this area. Local government units in the United Kingdom do organize meetings with local residents. Nonetheless, in Poland, I see absolutely no potential for change unless conservators and others, obviously it depends whether the given region or city can step in. I know that the community is hugely politicized, which does not help at all. In summary, do you see the role of the local government to be played herein? And do you think that any profound change to the system is something you would be inclined to recommend? Or do you think that improving whatever is going on now is a better solution? If I may, I am going to mention a number of experiences with regard to individual projects, but also in contact with investors, private investors included. Once the investor begins a quest for premises for a piece of real estate where he or she could engage in business operations, I know that in urban areas, people start looking with the municipal space administrators. They have lists of premises for rent. I believe that with regard to historical buildings, a common shared database ought to be put together with particular importance attached to attractive buildings. Obviously, this may smack of real estate agencies. Nonetheless, this is not the point. We would be focusing on municipal premises. Nonetheless, what we need is a unified and uniform and shared database, including attractive premises that could be shared with others. Secondly, once the investor reaches the municipal real estate administrative authority willing to invest, yet is not very much aware of what has to be done. And then, the officials would tell him, okay, that all you need is a renovation agreement or consensus. But no, that is not true, because what you need is the zoning plan permit and a construction permit and so on and so forth, which ultimately means that you cannot proceed as swiftly as you'd like. So I believe that should a website be put together, a website gathering all these buildings at a single location, that would be great. Not to mention the fact that all these buildings ought to be inventoried, including information whether the zoning plan permit has already been issued. Not to mention the fact that it ought to be specified very clearly whether a specific building ought to be used for catering or a restaurant purposes or a cafe or rather education. Now, why did I mention local governments? Because an investor, as an individual, approaches local governments, access is very difficult. And negotiating anything with a conservator is very, very difficult. So I believe that what we would need is a bespoke local government department or a bespoke municipal company, if you will, with a specialized focus on historical buildings in Warsaw. And they would also provide a form of counseling to take the potential investor by the hand, guiding him or her through the meanders of the procedure that he or she will have to follow. I know that sounds like wishful thinking still. Now, let me reverse the situation. I don't see the point of registers or evidence lists. We have two sets of buildings which have totally different names. I am from the industry. I know why it works that way. Owners of historical buildings do not consider any kind of evidence register as a list of historical buildings or historical monuments, because where there is no protection, there is no historical legacy or historical building. Possibly there had been the original idea behind the original plan, but then competencies were split between the regional and municipal conservator before the change, but I would be inclined to follow the Danish example. Now, Denmark has a single register. There is a specific scale or grading, if you will, of historical buildings. For example, with regard to the highest scoring buildings. For highest scoring buildings, you need a ministerial decision, whereas buildings lower on the scale, they can be dealt with by inspectors in municipalities. These buildings, these lower grade buildings, if you will, are still historical buildings. Nonetheless, this is a one-stop shop. All related know-how is based on the local zoning plan. And this is how it works. Nobody has a problem. Everybody knows what kind of building they are dealing with, which obviously translates ultimately into the cost of finishing, the cost of the price of the real estate, the price of the local plot, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Polish system, based on a municipal evidence system, a municipal list, if you will, means that we call some buildings historical buildings or historical monuments, albeit they are not subject to any kind of protection, and the name has been used at discretion, which means that we need a complete change of pace and change of system in order to follow a proven and credible European example.
So that is why we need to cooperate within European organizations. So we need to change in the system. One more question.
Okej, i tu jeszcze widzę, będzie jeszcze jedno i na tym będziemy kończyć.
So we have time for 2 additional questions and no more, and then we will finish our panel. Unfortunately, I cannot hear the question.
Marek Piekarek, ZGN. Dzień dobry.
Marek Piekarek, ZGN. Ladies and gentlemen, the leitmotif of our conference is having a discussion concerning our climate. And CO2 is a very important indicator when approaching climate issues. I am very happy that all the presentations that we could hear today were so interesting and full of professional information. But we know, unfortunately, that the issues that were touched upon only consider a small percentage of buildings in Poland, because you gave the examples of commercial buildings, and it's much easier to obtain these results for commercial buildings. And what about any experiences in multifamily buildings? Yes, we have certain experiences with such buildings, maybe not buildings in their entirety, but at least in parts of those buildings. So we have experience with apartments that are located in historical buildings, and the rules are the same. So the same systems are used. Of course, the situation is different regarding particular buildings, but we are able to install photovoltaic panels in certain places. However, the conservation specialist sometimes blocks us from using PVs in historical buildings. We can also improve energy performance of the buildings. We can sometimes insulate buildings from the outside, but mostly from the inside. And 54 Ogrodowa Street, we will insulate the building in the nearest future. So what we talked about today also pertains to housing buildings. But very often these apartments are for rent. They are not for sale, they are for rent. So there is a tender offer organized, and then people offer their bids and they are granted the right to rent such apartments. I don't know if this answers your question. Unfortunately, the interpreters cannot hear anything that is not said to the mic. So the workshops that we took part with under this program pertained to the housing buildings in several cities in Poland. Buildings are being renovated right now, and during those workshops we prepared models for processing those buildings. I took part in these workshops, and I know that the documentation has been prepared for the companies that are renovating these buildings right now. And there was a there were representatives of the offices which are equivalents of ZGNs, and they said that for sure there will be no money for certain activities, but for other aspects we can try to search for solutions. So there were examples of municipal housing buildings, multifamily buildings, that are under the competency of the conservation specialist and conservation officer. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bartosz Podłubny, representative of the Mazovian Conservation Office in Conservation Office. I would have one request. Please do not apply the same measure to the whole Poland. Maybe the system is similar. I'm sorry, I'm representing the Conservation Office in Podkarpackie province. And I must say that in Podkarpackie the situation is better. I think we do talk with the investors and we are successful in it. I would like to thank the representatives of the Łódź who say that they also talk with the conservation officers. Łukasz Konarzewski, who is conservation officer from Silesia, also says that they do have talks with investors. So we do talk with people. Please remember about that. I would like to refer to the time that is needed to take decisions in the city halls, in offices. It is a problem on the level of the system. For the last 6 years in Podkarpackie, we have had 56 members of staff, and actually it is just too few. We need more people. We need more people for better functioning. We only were awarded several new officers over the last time. We know there was a change in the law concerning the protection of historical buildings. So there are new legal regulations that are binding upon the conservation officers. And actually, in the past, this law was not being enforced well enough. But now, each and every officer is bound by these legal regulations and they must be enforced. Of course, we know that classification of historical monuments is not perfect. I know that we had this system in the past. We don't have to look up to the foreign examples. In the previous era, we had the classification of historical buildings, and we can hear certain signals from the ministry that they are thinking about going back to that system, so that a group of objects which are the most important and that need to meet the height requirements would be separated. One more thing concerning PV. This is my private opinion, my personal opinion. I think we shouldn't install PVs on each and every building. We are always looking up to the Western Europe, and sometimes I see images where in the whole city only the church is devoid of PVs on its roof, and all other buildings had PVs on their roofs. And it is actually like litter in the landscape. Actually, PVs shouldn't be installed on the rooftops. They should be installed on specifically devoted farms, not on the buildings. So thank you very much for this opinion. Thank you for taking the floor. We do not have time for any other questions. We are already behind the schedule, but I would like to invite you now to enjoy your coffee break and then to join the panel, to join the workshops. I'd like also to thank all our viewers online. Before you leave the room, please leave the headsets that you used for listening to interpretation. And we are meeting here once again 12:30 on the workshops. And a very important information, 2 workshops will be held in this room, so please do take all your belongings with you. And after the coffee break,